Great. My name is Sherry Antwine, and I'm here with Peter Forsyth. Together, we've worked on News on Wiki. News on Wiki is a project started this past cycle in the really in September, although we were mounting over the summer. And it's a campaign that's going into the end of February, focused on 3 areas: newspapers in the Caribbean, or Caribbean-focused newspapers, regional newspapers in states like Washington State, where we are this time around, and as well as Black-owned newspapers. So I'm going to put it over to Peter Forsyth, who will get us started and tell you a little bit more about the campaign.
All right, thanks, Sherry. So I thought I'd start us off with a slide just to really zero in on the very specific issue that we're trying to address in this project. This is one that's like our campaign is a very practical one. This is not sort of a deep philosophical exercise. This is really, we're looking to make an impact on how easily people can find reliable information about newspapers. So these 2 screenshots you see on the screen, the part circled in red, this is an info box that will show up on search engines. And you can see here we have one from Google and one from DuckDuckGo. And if there is sufficient Wikipedia content and or Wikidata content, it will present an info box like this right there on the search results screen. So in that way, by adding content to Wikipedia and Wikidata, we can influence what people are seeing, even if they don't visit Wikipedia or Wikidata. And so generating that kind of content is the purpose of this campaign. And as Sherry was just saying, for this phase, we have 3 specific areas. We're doing Washington State, Black-owned newspapers, and the Caribbean, to have a scientific approach to be able to compare our impact and look at it versus other areas.
And I should mention that this project started in 2018, and it covered the entire United States. So it started off as a general project with Pete and a few others. And now what we're doing is we're kind of honing into some samples. So breaking it down into a regional focus, a state focus, so we've got a demographic focus, which Black-owned newspapers, regional focus, which is wider, covering the Caribbean, and then we've got a small, more pinpoint focus, which is on state. We're starting off with Washington State, and so each of those models allows us to kind of examine what's happening there in different areas. So if you see, it's starting off big, and now it's crunching down into a more focal point, so that what we learn from the campaigns in those areas can help for, like, for example, further campaigns if we go off into more specific regions.
So we'd like to highlight a few of the events and activities that we've done. On this screen, these are some of the things that we did just to build our outreach early on and bring attention to the project, because what we're really looking to do is encourage volunteers to write these articles. So we presented at the Open Publishing Fest last spring at the Juneteenth event that Sherry and AfroCrowd put together in June, and also at AfroCrowd BIPOC event later in the summer. And at that event, we had news reporters. So we're always looking for opportunities to present this idea. We found it's a pretty resonant one, and so exposing reporters to our work is a helpful thing. We launched with an event that I think was a very successful webinar about making lists of newspapers. So what are those lists that we're working from to add new articles? And so we had librarians we had a librarian from the University of Virginia and one from Vermont, who both had deep experience with Wikipedia, it was a very information-rich webinar. I would highly recommend this one in particular if you're looking to view something from our project, because I'm sure you'll learn something from this one. I'm not going to mention every single one of these just so that we get through our slides, unless, Sherry, if there's something you want to speak up about, jump in.
Yeah, I should mention that what Pete just mentioned was that we have video from our events. And we're available both on Meta and on Wikipedia. So at the end, we'll have a way for you to look in further detail about these events and what we've done.
So we've also we did an event with New York University, wiki training for students interested in editing Wikipedia. We were on a podcast, the launch of the Pedagogy podcast. And then in November, we had a deeper partnership with a university class. And this was really something that really took off. So Professor Christy Roschke at Arizona State University had been following this campaign in 2018 when Mike Caulfield had originally launched it. She was interested in it. She was following his Twitter and his YouTube, but hadn't been super engaged. This time around, she decided she really wanted to introduce it to her students, and I think it was a big success. We'll see examples in a minute of a couple of her students' work. And then in December, we presented at the Wiki Conference North America, which, as I'm sure a lot of you know, came together very quickly and was really a big success, transitioning to a virtual form for COVID times. And in this one, in a way, we're kind of more ambitious. We had a 3-hour edit-a-thon. So instead of just talking about the ideas, we really wanted to have a session where people sat down and did the work. And we were really pleased with how well it went. Even with pretty last-minute notice, we had 34 people join us, and 22 of them stayed for the full 3 hours.
And I should mention that during the event, it spurred on interest from other people who came, and later on included it in their presentations and their outreach. So it really was a good building event to build a community around News on Wiki as well. So we've done several other things that we could highlight as well. You can feel free to read them on the slides, which will also be available. And we're going to be talking about a few case studies from our different projects that kind of highlight the shape of the campaign and what's been happening with it. From here, though, you can take a look at some of the newspapers that we've been able to spread out and add. A lot of the students that we worked with, especially, were not just learning about editing Wikipedia, but they were also learning more about these papers and their impact on communities and historical impacts as well. In one case in particular, we had a students looking at Black suffragists, and her newspaper, which actually turned out hadn't been included on Wikipedia, although her biography was. So that was one particular instance where we had a lot of live learning in more ways than one. If we can go to the next slide. Here's some samples. It's just take a look at what's been kind of what a sample would look like from the project. And this is a thorough article written by a returning leader from phase 1, but which I mentioned was from 2018. And it was during our Arizona State University exercise session with earlier on that focused on Black-owned newspapers.
And I would point out with these ones that just for the sake of a screenshot, it's really just the intro. So as you can see from the contents, there's actually a fair amount more detail.
Yes, it is on the end.
So these are some drafts that have been started, so some work in progress. Actually, I think since we made the slide, I think 1 or 2 of these have actually been completed. With the Caribbean, this is going to be our big focus towards the end. Sherry, do you want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm excited to say that we've this time around where we've expanded into the Caribbean, and we connected with the Caribbean community through Wikimedians of the Caribbean, which I also help lead. And it is a community of people who are interested in the Caribbean and the diaspora. So we're looking at newspapers that are based in the Caribbean. And I also think it's a good idea to understand just how vast each island represents, the challenge that each island represents. Because we're not only looking at an entire nation, we're also looking at different languages that are spoken. There's also dialects and newspapers in those dialects. So it's looking like the Caribbean is a good ground to continue to work on as well, because as has been mentioned, there is a colonial factor when you're looking at, and a westernization when you're looking at reliable sources. And in the Caribbean, that's no different. And there's where sometimes you may have information available about an event in the Caribbean in a newspaper that's more widely known in outside the Caribbean. Newspaper sources that are in the Caribbean can often be overlooked. So that's one area that we're looking at as well. We connected with the Caribbean community during Caribbean Festival, and looking forward to connecting with them again in a few days at Wikipedia Day, when we're going to be looking at newspaper editing around the environment.
All right. So here we've listed, there are a few general challenges that we're still working with. In the last presentation, there was some discussion of the differences among languages. We certainly, especially when it comes to the Caribbean, we want to be making more inroads into French and Spanish and other language newspapers that might be a little bit invisible to us as primarily English speakers. We found that with making lists, there are many different kinds of lists on Wikipedia, and it introduces some complexity. So there's sort of a data project of how do we deal with the formal Wikipedia list of newspapers in a certain state versus the wiki project based sort of under the hood list that might exist versus the list that we get from Wikidata. How do we kind of merge all of these different things together and wrap our arms around it? This slide shows a map that this technology was put together by a participant originally in 2018, and we've adapted it to be able to look at one state at a time, which basically it draws a map based on information in Wikidata. And where you see a red dot, that means there's a newspaper, but it doesn't have a Wikipedia article, and a green dot does have an article with an info box. If it's yellow, there's an article without an info box. So as you can see, this really lets us kind of keep track of our progress, but there's a lot of work to be done to really make this a nice, fluid, usable system. And here, this is an example of a Wikidata item. This is the entire Wikidata item for this particular paper, so it's not enormous. It doesn't have an enormous amount of information, but it's enough to be very useful. It's enough to place it on that map. It's also enough to link it up to some other databases. As you can see at the bottom, there are links to databases outside of the wiki space. And I think we want to be sure to invite you to, Sherry and I are both involved in a general Wikipedia's birthday celebration on Friday, where we're going to have Ward Cunningham, who's the inventor of Wiki software, Alexandria Lockett, who is one of the very first people to use Wikipedia as a teaching tool in a college classroom, and a number of other speakers reflecting on the importance of 20 years of Wikipedia, and News on Wiki will be a part of that. And then we also have another event that day for the Caribbean, which, Sherry, do you want to talk about that one a little bit? I don't think we put that one in the slide.
Yes, we're going to be launching something called Wiki Translate the Environment. So it's going to be with Wiki Caribbean, and AfriCrowd, and partners like News on Wiki, some people from Federated Wiki, and from different environmental communities. And the focus really is to explore information about the environment on Wikipedia, especially concerning areas like the Caribbean, but also to go deeper. And what we're going to be trying to do is get information that is available. For example, it might be available in German, or it might be available in Chinese or Spanish, but not available in English, and vice versa. And we're gonna be inviting people to join us to kind of improve that information over a length of time. So we're going to be launching on the 15th, and it's going to be going all the way up to Earth Day on April 22nd. And the hope is by then we'll have a breadth of information that's been translated and improved on the environment in that time.
So Sherry, I'm pulling up the link for that. Sherry, maybe you want to continue with our last slide?
Sure. So all of this information, including the information about Wiki Translate the Environment, is going to be on these slides. And we invite you to also join the News on Wiki community online. We're both on Meta and on Wiki, like Wikipedia, like we mentioned, as well as we have we're active on Twitter, where we're seeing a growing community there at NewsWiki1. And we're also, you can always follow us on hashtag #NewsOnWiki. And both Pete and I are available as well to connect with. We'll include our information in the chat.